There was, however, a moment later on in 1939 when the Soviet Union also attacked Finland, during which the British, they started a debate whether this decision not to declare war against the Soviet Union during the invasion of Poland might have been a mistake, and maybe now it was time to declare war against the Soviet Union. The British actually started preparing a lot of military aid for Finland. It never came to fruition. There were diplomatic reasons for that stopped it, but there was a moment in which it was close for Great Britain to send military aid to Finland and declare war against the Soviet Union. However, since that didn't happen, it made it a lot easier for the Western Allies and the Soviet Union to strike up a cooperation after Operation Barbarossa. The Poles and the Soviets, which naturally had been enemies since the Soviet Union invaded Poland, they had to be brought to the table by the British as well. And the so-called Sikorski-Maijski agreement was signed between the Poles and the Soviet Union, turning these two former enemies into allies. That alliance was broken in 1943 after fortunes had turned on the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union was no longer backed up against the wall as they had been previously. They had managed to fend off the Germans in Stalingrad. They were victorious during the Battle of Kursk. And at that moment, the Germans discovered the mass graves of the Katyn massacre. They informed the world about it. They had the Red Cross to come and inspect the graves, and the Poles, they quickly realized that the Germans were telling the truth for once, and the Soviets were the perpetrators of that massacre on 22,000 Polish officers. And thus, the Poles, they asked for the Red Cross to do a full investigation of who was behind it. This was something that the Soviets used as an excuse to completely break off diplomatic relations with the Polish government in exile in London. So these relations between, and naturally the British and the Americans, but mainly the British, they tried to mend that relationship. They tried through various different ways, coming with some diplomatic solution that would lead to renewed diplomatic relations between Poland and the Soviet Union, but that never happened. The Soviets, they had their own plans for Poland after the war, and the Polish government in exile in London and its return to Warsaw was definitely not part of those plans. So when we look at the invasion, the Soviet invasion of Poland in 1939, you have a lot of that chaos that was also visible in Ukraine early on in the war. You have these various narratives coming from different sides, trying to give an explanation for why something has happened, what are the reasons behind it. Maybe the war in Ukraine could be a little bit clearer, since at least in 1939 you had the Wehrmacht that invaded 2 weeks before the Soviets, so it made it slightly easier for the Soviet Union to try to defend its own position, but nevertheless, to a vast majority of politicians around the world, it was clear that the Soviets, they had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Germans just a week before the German invasion of Poland. And soon, 2 weeks later, you have 700,000 Red Army soldiers crossing into Poland at a moment when Poland is still fighting and still has a fighting chance with these reinforcements being on the way from the Western Allies. Also, Romania was actually offering great help for Poland during the German invasion. The Poles, they told the Romanians that right now we don't want you to be involved in the war directly. We want you to provide us with support from our rear, so to say, with this ammunition and weapons coming through the ports, the Romanian ports on the Black Sea. So they really turned it down at that moment. However, the Soviet aggression on September 17th, it was also clear that this wasn't some improvised operation that happened. The Soviets had started preparing for this as soon as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed. For example, on September 1st, the first day of the German invasion, the Germans contacted the Soviets and asked them to give the Germans access to a radio station in Minsk in Belarus, through which the Germans would be able to send signals, radio signals, to their armed forces in Poland, and thus aiding the invasion. So from the first day of the invasion, the Soviets were actively aiding the invading German army.